One of the big problems that led to price declines back during the great financial crisis was the fact that we had just an overwhelming amount of foreclosures that all hit the US housing market within the span of a few years, and that made inventory skyrocket back then. And when you combine that with the fact that we were in a massive recession, unemployment rate had spiked to 10%, the economy wasn't doing well. Well, right now, I feel like we're in a position where we're starting to see the early signs of that. And that's because delinquencies on mortgages continue to rise. In fact, it's up 15% year over year. According to a recent report from TransUnion, this is actually the 6th consecutive quarter of delinquency increases. So we're talking a year and a half now that pre-foreclosures or mortgage delinquencies have been steadily on the rise. So what that tells you is people slowly, more and more, can no longer afford to pay the mortgage. And obviously some of this is due to the fact that people are no longer able to have the forbearance programs that keep them out of delinquency and made it essentially so they don't have to pay their mortgage. So all that stuff is over. So combine it with that, plus the struggling economy, we're seeing higher delinquencies. And we're talking about all stages of delinquencies on top of that. From early, mid, and late delinquencies, this is a big deal because once somebody goes past being 90 days delinquent on their mortgage, foreclosure is imminent. They're gonna get foreclosed on unless they can come up with a way to pay back that money that they haven't been paying. And it's even worse for people that have been in mortgage forbearance for the last couple of years because those guys have 2 years, 3 years of mortgage payments that were not made. We're literally talking about hundreds of thousands of Americans right now that are in this position. This is a situation that has slowly been building and has been getting worse over the past 2 years. Now, yes, it is true that mortgage delinquencies are near historic lows right now, but the fact that the trend is finally starting to reverse and starting to go in the other direction is what people need to be paying attention to. Because a lot of people thought that this just wouldn't happen. I mean, just look at the price cuts right now. We are seeing a record amount of price cuts on the US housing market. According to Redfin, it's about 7% of listings have a price cut right now. And what do these two things mean? Well, even though they're not massive numbers, what they are is they are signs of change. It means that things are slowly starting to turn around into the opposite direction. And historically speaking, when we see higher delinquencies, it leads to higher foreclosure activity. And that is according to Adam Data Research. Their mid-year foreclosure market report showed an alarming increase in foreclosure filings. In the first half of 2023 alone, there's about 185,000 foreclosure filings across the country, guys. Now that's nowhere near 2-something million we saw during the great financial crisis, but it's definitely a lot of people potentially losing their homes. And this is where the numbers really start to become alarming because that is a 13% increase from 1 year ago. And get this, it's a 185% increase from 2 years ago. That is insane, 185% increase in foreclosure filings within 2 years, guys. That's astounding. So that's why I think it's important to not just look at, oh, well, foreclosures are still historically low. No, I would be looking at the fact that, well, they're starting to ramp up dramatically and what that might mean for things looking forward. Because I'm always a looking forward kind of guy. Yesterday's gone. Who cares what happened yesterday? Because the only thing that matters is what's happening right now and what might happen tomorrow. The only reason to pay attention to the past is to learn from it. Even the CEO over at Adam, he says that even though the foreclosure activity is near the historical norms, the surge in foreclosures that we're seeing could be a sign that we're going to see many more foreclosures coming in the years to come. Apparently, the states that are getting hit the hardest with this right now are Maryland, Oregon, and Alaska. The foreclosure rates in those 3 states have doubled. And to make matters worse, the mortgage balances are also climbing towards record highs at $11.8 trillion, and that's a 3% increase year over year. Once again, following this theme that more and more people have more and more debt than ever before, whether it's mortgage debt, credit card debt, HELOC debt. Does it really matter, guys? Debt is debt. The only time that works in your favor is if it's good debt and you are putting that debt to work and it's actually earning you money. But that's not the case for everything we're talking about here. This is what I find to be one of the most interesting things about this whole story. is that loans that were originated back in the third quarter of 2021 with a 2.98% interest rate and loans from 2022 with an average interest rate of 5.9%, those are the loans that are exhibiting the highest level of delinquencies right now. And that's kind of surprising considering that these loans were just made a year or two ago. So why is that, guys? Why are people that got these low interest rates not paying the mortgage right now? Because when they look at mortgages that were originated back in the third quarter of 2017 through 2020, there's way less delinquencies for those loans. And what this suggests is that loans that were originated under these current economic conditions may be under unprecedented pressure. Well, wait a minute, what's going on here, Michael? I thought that people that have a 3% interest rate would never let that go. People are never letting go of that 3% interest rate. They have golden handcuffs. They're going to be stuck in that house forever until rates go back down past 3%. Well, apparently not, because this data suggests otherwise. And I guess it doesn't matter how low your interest rate is if you can't pay your bills, guys. That's kind of the lesson to be learned from this right now when we're seeing this surprising uptick in delinquencies. Well, we've come across the latest flip. We have a house here, 5-bedroom, 4-bath for $4.2 million. They bought it back in 2021 for $2.45 million, and now we're asking another $1.5 million for this house. Will they get it, guys? Do you want me to keep showing these flips in these videos? Let me know in the comments. And the property taxes here are a cool $35,000 per year. One interesting part of this report also shows that there's been a slight uptick in year-over-year equity, which amounts to about $19.7 trillion nationwide. But that's interesting because I have a story later on here that kind of contradicts this, which we'll talk about. And the other notable thing from this is the amount of HELOC loans, home equity lines of credit, are not at all-time highs anymore, but they're still higher than they were between the years of 2008 and 2021. What's going on here, guys? The recurring theme that I keep gathering from all this information is more and more debt. More people taking on more debt, more mortgage debt, more HELOC debt, more credit card debt, more personal loan debt, more auto loan debt. And let's face it, in the light of inflation, all that stuff starts to add up pretty quickly, and it gets to a point faster than you think of where you actually can't pay for this stuff. There's only so much room in people's budget, and people have to start deciding what's going to go first. And apparently, we already know that the car loans are one of the things that are definitely going to go first, as well as the credit cards, because people are stopping to pay those like there's no tomorrow. But now we're starting to see it translate little by little into the mortgage market. And this is something I've been predicting that was going to happen, and lo and behold, we are seeing it. Speaking of delinquencies, it's also important to note how much the commercial real estate delinquencies have been going up. Let's take a look at this chart. This chart shows you the delinquency rate for multifamily housing, and it's literally now at the highest level that we've seen since the great financial crisis. People always ask how I can talk about all this stuff and keep walking and holding the camera. Well, as you see, sometimes I trip. And when I do, it hurts because I'm wearing sandals, so I stub my toe pretty good. And that's the other common theme we're seeing with all this stuff too, like the greatest levels of delinquency since the 2008 financial crisis, right? The greatest number of auto loan delinquencies since then. The greatest number of people stopping to pay their credit card bills since then. Like, it's all starting to come around. And obviously, it's not just multifamily. The office sector has been hit the hardest. But this chart here shows the amount of delinquent commercial real estate loans in total, and you can see how much it is spiking. It is spiking tremendously, the highest level that we've seen in over a decade, guys. That's the recurring theme, the highest amount of everything since the great financial crisis. So it's just kind of funny to me that we see all these things that parallel what happened back then, but nobody wants to admit that that's a direction we're headed, even though it's happening right in front of our faces. And I think so many people just have a short-term memory when it comes to that it was a slow and steady decline during that time. It's not like things just flipped overnight. There was a steady series of events that triggered the recession and allowed stock prices and home prices to continue to fall. It's not like any of this happened overnight. But I think since then, that was 15 years ago, guys, almost 16 years ago. One thing that's definitely changed since then is people's mentality, okay? Because with the rise of the smartphone and social media and instant gratification, people now think in their mind that everything's supposed to happen immediately. You know, if I can get Amazon groceries delivered to my door within the next 2 hours, then the financial crisis is supposed to happen in a span of 1 month. No, but that's not how it works. These financial markets are something that have not changed in terms of the speed at which things turn around. But it is notable that the speed of things turning around is happening faster than it did before. But even though it's happening faster than last time, it's still slow compared to people's expectations of how fast things are supposed to happen in general today. And that's one of the main reasons I think a lot of people can't really see what's going on here. Now, according to the last report from TransUnion, home equity is up. But according to another report from Adam, it's a contradicting report, says that the equity-rich portion of mortgage homes have slipped at the fastest pace than we've seen in the last 4 years. And basically what this means is in 2023, the U.S. Home Equity and Underwater report from Adam says that 47.4% of mortgaged residential properties in the U.S. were considered equity-rich in the third quarter. And that's down from 49.2% in the second quarter. So you're talking about 2% of households that have a mortgage have lost a substantial amount of equity just in the past quarter. Well, why is that? What's going on? And this is not just happening in one place, guys. We're talking about in more than half of the country, because the amount of mortgages that were equity rich went down in 29 of the 50 US states, and the biggest declines were in South Carolina, Florida, and Kentucky. But obviously, depending on where you live, you could still see home equity and home values rising in your area. That is not unheard of right now. Here's an even more fascinating aspect to this. According to Adam's data, one of the reasons that this might be happening might not only be because home prices are coming down, but it also could be because more and more people are getting home equity loans or home equity lines of credit on their houses. When people do that, the amount of equity that they have in their home falls because they just borrowed a bunch of it. So when you combine home equity loans and home equity lines of credit with falling home prices, we're seeing substantial declines in home equity values across the country. And it also means that more people are borrowing against their homes. Just like we talked about earlier. Once again, the recurring theme of never-ending debt, guys. More and more people choosing to borrow against their homes is where we're at with this. And then to me, it's no surprise when you see other stories like this one here, because this story was sent to me by one of you guys. Sorry you didn't put your name, so I can't say who it was, but the story is about how the world is drowning in debt again. Well, obviously, that's definitely the case over here in the US with all forms of debt, like we just talked about. But it's not just us, guys. It's happening worldwide. In fact, there was a warning from the IMF's latest global outlook that many countries are now on the course to grow at half the rate that they used to, which leaves the world on track to permanently lower growth that exposes it to economic shocks and diminished opportunities to overcome the scarring from the pandemic and the war. So, because so many countries have been reliant on debt to grow their economies, this basically means that the party is almost over. Because now that people can no longer take on more debt, now that banks are tightening up lending standards and the amount of borrowing is starting to dry up, especially because interest rates are so high, this is basically putting an end to this debt party worldwide. And what it also means is that all these countries, they have a growth model that's based completely on borrowing. Obviously, that's the way it is here in the US. Like, we cannot grow our economy without borrowing money and quantitative easing anymore, because we don't make anything here. We don't add any real value to anybody no more. We basically just run technology companies here now. And the problem is, whenever the borrowing slows down, so does the growth in the economy. Well, since the entire world is addicted to using debt to grow their economies, you can see how this becomes a problem pretty quickly. And the other problem with this whole needing debt to grow the economy situation is it puts all these countries in the position where they have to borrow massive amounts of debt to fill the gap between what they're bringing in taxes and what they're actually spending. So it's the only way to actually come up with enough money, because they're not collecting enough money in taxes and they're not cutting back on their spending. So the only way to come up with the extra money is to borrow it. You know who else is becoming delinquent and starting to default? Actual countries, guys. It's not just people with mortgages and people with credit card debt that are not paying their bills. Countries are not paying their bills now. And companies are not paying their bills. I covered that when I was in California. In fact, last year in 2022, we saw the highest number of sovereign defaults since 1983. And this number could be surpassed in 2023 if things continue on this course, which they probably will. And for anybody doing the math, that's the highest amount of countries not paying their bills in 40 years, guys. 40 years. And because of these rising interest rates, it's led to missed payments on debt that's worth about $550 billion this year. And just to put that in perspective, in 2019, the total amount worldwide was only $330 billion in missed debt payments, and it's already $550 billion and the year's not even over. And so the biggest problem that all these nations are facing, including the US, is how much money are we willing to spend on debt payments? That's the biggest issue that we're now facing, because even this year, we're gonna hit over $1 trillion that's gonna be paid just on debt payments here in the US. That's not even counting all the interest that's gonna be paid by other countries. And it turns out that ever since we had a big downturn in 2020 due to the pandemic, every year of global economic growth has been worse than the previous one. And 2023 is on track to be no different. So we've had 3 years now of stunted global growth, even though a massive amount of stimulus was injected into the economies. That's not a good sign, because that means there's really no way to reverse any of this besides letting things fall to where they should be and eventually picking up the pieces from there. That's what I think that they should have done all along. It's something that should have been done all the way back in 2008 when we had the first great financial crisis. And instead of printing all the money back then and having all the bailouts, they should have just let it fall to where it needed to be and pick up the economy from there. But because they didn't do that, you know, they basically just built on top of the mess that was already being created back then. This brings us to where we are today, which is even a bigger mess than before. And one of the biggest risks right now for the entire world is that the world slips into a lost decade because of this time bomb of debt. You know, we have all this debt that's going to have to be refinanced just in the commercial real estate market alone in the next few years. That's going to cause massive defaults and delinquencies like we're already seeing. But this is going to translate to other areas of the economy as well. It's not just going to be commercial real estate. And so they're saying here that the first half of the 2020s have already been completely ruined, guys. And I agree, like, this economy is not going to turn around in any meaningful way until probably in the 2030s. So now it's only a matter of what do we do from here to fix this? Well, in my opinion, the only thing that can be done is to just let it all crash and burn and start from the beginning. Whatever that beginning ends up being. I don't know how bad things could potentially get if they just stop with all these borrowing and debt shenanigans. Obviously, the world financial markets will cease to exist as we know it, and a lot of people look at that as a bad thing, but I don't think it's a bad thing. It might be a bad thing temporarily because it's going to hurt a lot of people in the beginning, but once that initial pain has been lived through, eventually things will get better. That's what I think would happen. But we all know that the likelihood of that happening is practically near zero. They would rather blow things up in the opposite direction. They don't want to blow it up in a positive direction, which can actually help us in the long term. They'd rather put us into all-out poverty mode and blow up this debt bubble past the point where it can no longer be blown up. Let it explode from there, because at least the people who are in charge of blowing up this debt bubble will get away with murder in the sense that they'll be able to walk away with their millions or billions while everybody else is poor. So, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you don't want to wait for my next video to come out, check out this one on the screen right over here, and I'll see you in the next one.